Today, I'm going to be sharing with you a gem that I found online that I think so far is easily the best kept secret and the best way to mimic that Copic marker traditional feel digitally. Best brushes, textures, blending modes, everything. Perfect. It is no secret that Copic markers, and honestly brush markers in general, but especially Copic markers, are expensive. You'll remember me talking about working on Apple Black Volume 5's cover, where I had to do some mumbo jumbo to make it work because my Copic markers were drying out. You gotta replace them, get some filler, maybe buy brand new ones, because I'm not gonna lie, I've had mine for years. So they do last. We've experimented on the channel with Copic marker alternatives, all kinds of stuff. However, you might have found a solution worth $0. Well, I guess not $0 if you don't have digital software. Might have to tweak a couple things here and there, but generally it works for any art software. We're going to be using Clip Studio Paint, but it could also work for Photoshop or whatever. I think best so in Clip Studio Paint, where we'll be using some pretty sick brushes and textures to mimic a Copic marker feel without Copic markers. All digital. To test this out, we're going to be using Opal Watmore as a model for this video. That is one of the lead characters of Apple Black, my manga series. Multiple volumes out. Volume 5, like we talked about earlier, will be out in November. Here's a review. And a light novel that's essentially a prequel to the current events in the manga. Read it. Let it go! First, we get a digital brushes, import any brushes, click the hamburger, and then to import subtool. After that, you find where the brush is located. Usually it has a .abr or a .sut. The brush in question was created by Stallcry. I believe that's also their name on DeviantArt. You hit OK, and then you have it. In this case, I already have it, and this is how it's going to look. I want to make sure I'm in the appropriate brush that I want it in, so before I even did any of this, I hit shortcut B under brush. Depending on the software you're using, however you can import brushes or textures or whatever, you do that. Now for the textures, you go to Window, then Material, and then Material Download. Go open this. You want to make sure you hit Download again, find the blue icon, and then click and drag. Once you do that, it'll create a folder layer, and within that folder, it'll have all the textures and the right blending modes and all of that. And that way you can click and drag the folder layer and do with it what you will. You can get the texture in the Clip Studio Paint community, or the links in the description and the Gumroad. There's also additional brushes you can use there, or within the Gumroad we'll have pages that we've worked on, like the one in this video. And then you can take the folder layer from there. The brushes, the textures, the layers, sample images, everything you can find on my Gumroad for free. If that makes this tutorial overall easier to follow, you can just get it from there. With your new brushes, you pick the one you want. Watercolor thingy is good, watercolor 2 is good. Create a new layer, pick a color, and just go ham and see how it works. Feel free to reduce the opacity of some of the textures in the folder, because one of them maybe is a bit too harsh, or just turn them off altogether. You can create a new layer and change the blending mode, usually to darken, but feel free to experiment. And with this new layer, you can use it to shade. So you pick a different hue and then work your way with that. After this, you pretty much have gotten the hang of it. And that's the main gist. Now we can test it and apply it to a head of Opal Watmore. We're doing all the same things as before. Here we have a layer for the flats. You can apply it however you want, but here on that flats layer, I'm just putting in the flats. Use the magic wand, shortcut W, select the parts you want, Alt Delete or Option Delete, or just fill, and then you see how it works. We did it for the face, but we can use a brush or a pen tool to just manually fill it in. Sometimes with a brush, depending on the brush, some parts would be a little bit transparent. We want this to be filled in flat. But right now it doesn't look flat because of that texture folder above. And already it looks pretty cool. One thing you might want to do in certain situations is expand the canvas, make it a little bigger. So to the top, edit, change canvas size, and then just adjust the settings however you see fit. I select all the layers to expand them as well. If you select all the layers and then hit Control T or Command T, it will just kind of select everything for you, and then you can scale it up. You can open the folder, see the textures within it. One of them, I'm going to reduce the opacity because again, I think it's a bit too harsh, but ultimately it's up to you. Here you can customize however you see fit. You can even turn off one of the textures if you think that's what works. These are just kind of mimicking, you know, the feel of the paper. So depending on the paper texture, you get the vibe you want. So with both textures, it kind of makes the digital markers look older, but with just one of them, the one above, it looks a bit smoother. It's still got a texture, but it looks a bit smoother. Ultimately, I thought this would be a great way to show you guys how you can save some money while getting some of that same Copic marker vibes, some of that traditional vibe, even though we're working digitally. First saw this trick from a friend of mine, Rashad, who has his own YouTube channel, and he talks about this very topic on there as well, so you can see the way he does things. But we're going to be showing a slightly different approach here on this channel, and definitely answering any questions you might have in the comments below. And then at the end of the video, I show other ways you can use some of the techniques, tips, and tricks that we gather here, and you can use it anywhere else. A lot of this is still learning how to play around with digital stuff and develop maybe your own style with elements that you learned today. This technique is not complicated, and it gets even easier the more you do it. You can also use actual Copic swatches. So these are actual Copic markers that exist. I'm here on the website. I'm just gonna right click and save the image and then open it up in Clip Studio Paint. This way I can use the eyedropper tool, shortcut I, and just select the actual colors directly, further mimicking that Copic marker feel. You can do this or create swatches in Clip Studio Paint or Photoshop or whatever you're working with. Find the way that works best. You can even open it in the same canvas if you want. But now I'm picking actual colors and I'm changing it for the flats that I've chosen for her skin. Don't mind making errors. I can always Control Z, Command Z. I'm not afraid of the alcohol messing up because I can always go back or just erase. The perks of digital. Once I find the flats I want, then Nemo darken and it's above the flats, making sure we're clipping it to the layer below. That way, when we color, we don't color outside of the flat region. And then I pick a darker hue like you would coloring traditionally, and then you go over the skin. For the lighter parts, especially when drawing skin, sometimes I would just omit certain parts to show light and just not color over those parts. You could do that here digitally, or you could do the same thing, but a new layer, also clip this layer to the flats, change the blending mode to like maybe add or lighten, pick the appropriate hue, and then we go over. And if it's too harsh, you can reduce the opacity, go back on the darken layer, and then we add more shading. And this whole time we're using colors that actually exist within Copic marker swatches. You can go back to the flats and then change some of the flats so we have the appropriate original colors. So I'm gonna do the same for her eyes, her hair, her jewelry, eyebrows, everything where I see fit. And the whole time we're using colors that actually exist. To see better, you can turn off the texture folder and then put in all the flats and then turn it back on. Turn on the shade layer that we have on darken, turn on the lighten layer, and we just go ham. For the hair, we're not using the same color to shade that we had on the skin. For the hair, we wanna pick a different hue, again, one that exists within Copic swatches. But ultimately, obviously, you can experiment and not limit yourself to this, but again, we're trying to mimic the whole Copic marker vibe, so you can do this if you want. Depending on the color I'm above on the flats, I'll change to the appropriate hue. So it's a different hue for the darkened parts of the hair, different for the skin, different for the eyes. For the eyes, I usually do a C1 or C3, and then for the darkened version, I do a C5 or a C7. But I'm just using the eyedropper tool, shortcut I, to hit the color I want on the swatches, then come back to this canvas, and I start working appropriately. On the add glow or lighten layer, I'm adding highlights to the hair. On an extra layer, I'm doing that shine in the eyes to make the character feel alive. If I was working traditionally, I'd probably use like white ink to do that. And then we just keep working on the character until we're satisfied. When it comes to the adjustment and correction layers, you hit the hamburger on the right, the new correction layer, and then tone curve. Bend the curve how you see fit. The goal is to make it a little bit lighter, mimicking what it will look like, say, after you scan the image. Usually it wouldn't be this saturated, unless you did turn the saturation to be really high, which I often think about. When you scan an image, it automatically is digital. So it's kind of like all traditional stuff. If you're looking at it through a screen, it's kind of digital at that point, isn't it? Let's not get sidetracked. With the tone curve, it just looks a little bit more natural. Then for like a colorless blender, if the shading looks a bit too harsh, shortcut J in Clip Studio Paint, but you do what's appropriate in whatever software you're using. And just like a colorless blender in real life, you can just use the blur to blend things here. Make sure you're on the appropriate layer. In this case would be the shade layer, and just make sure it looks a little bit more seamless and not harsh lines, unless the harsh lines are what you want. And then overall, we'll do more fine tuning. On the light layer, we're going in a little bit more to show detail in the highlights in the hair. On that eye shine layer, we're putting more whites on the jewelry just to make it shine and pop a little bit more. The jewelry in her ear. And then we just keep working on it until we're satisfied. I added a new correction layer, this time under hues. I go to saturation and I reduce it. And again, it looks more natural to what it reminds me of when I did work with Copic markers and scan it in. And after this, we're pretty much done. I'm just going to experiment a bit, trying to see what it will look like without some of the texture layers turned on inside that texture folder. And depending on the vibe you're going for, you go with what works. We could do more stuff, add more detail, yada, yada, yada. But for starters, I think you guys get the hang. Keep in mind, I've already done a couple other illustrations, one for RDC and a Yasuke one. I have a separate video on that, talking about a bunch of stuff. But point is, even with these illustrations, I actually experimented a little bit more, and I just picked flats. And then I had a singular shading layer with one color linear burn, and it was a dark hue depending on the mood of the place. And I just shaded that way, not paying attention to any of the Copic swatches at all. And it still looks pretty traditional. And while it doesn't look as traditional as the Opal Want More head, it still looks pretty traditional. So you can experiment with all of these, and I hope you guys have a blast. Talk about a Copic marker alternative. It's only going to get better from here. I'm usually always faster with digital stuff anyways. There's always going to be a place for traditional art and Copic markers, but sometimes if I want to get something quickly done, I still want to have that Copic marker feel, this is the best way to go. At least this is the way I'm going to go. Just look at all the fun times that we've had with our Copic markers. However, there comes a time where the markers dry out. They're expensive to refill or replace. Deadline is approaching, and so you must cook up a plan to find the ultimate Copic marker replacement. And then the more you do it, the more we experiment and play around with this technique, the better it becomes over time. If you guys have any questions, you can let me know in the comments below. But also, if you guys have any tips and tricks you can add on to this, leave in the comments below. For the 2.5 people that made it to the end of this video, oh, thank you. Do all the fun engagement stuff. It helps the channel a great deal. Big announcements to come as well. Check out more videos on the channel. Like, subscribe, Holy Ghost, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell so you stay notified each time I upload absolutely anything. Turn on all notifications. That's my manga.